Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to be shattered in the most brutal way? Imagine being pregnant, standing in a hospital, and the man who vowed to love you raises his hand against you. How would you feel? The waiting room of the private maternity wing was supposed to be a place of safety, filled with the hushed murmurs of anxious families and the steady rhythm of hope. Instead, it became the stage for an act so vile, so brazen, that the entire hospital would never forget it. The fluorescent lights glared down on polished floors, catching every glint of diamonds on the wrist of Alexander Grant, a self-made millionaire who believed money gave him the right to do anything, even humiliate the woman carrying his child. His wife, Evelyn Grant, was 7 months pregnant. Her belly swelled beneath her soft cream dress, and her hands trembled as she held her medical folder against her chest. She had been waiting for hours for her checkup, trying to ignore the cutting remarks Alexander had thrown at her since they left their penthouse. He was restless, irritated, endlessly scrolling on his phone, barking at assistants through Bluetooth, as though her appointment was nothing but an inconvenient pause in his empire-building schedule. But Evelyn, though fragile in appearance, was holding on to something he had long forgotten: dignity. Every time he rolled his eyes, every sigh he let escape, she reminded herself to stay calm, to focus on the baby. She didn't want stress to harm the little life inside her. Yet what happened next went far beyond stress. It was humiliation carved into the heart of a woman who had already given up so much for the man she thought she loved. The nurse finally appeared in the doorway, calling her name. Evelyn rose carefully, pressing a hand against her back, and smiled softly at Alexander. "It's just a quick check. You don't have to stay if you're busy," she whispered, hoping to soothe him. But Alexander's face twisted, sharp and cruel, his voice booming across the waiting room. "Don't embarrass me, Evelyn. Do you think I have time to sit here while you waste everyone's day with your nonsense? You're not even sick, you're just fat with that baby. Hurry up." A hush fell over the other patients. A mother holding her toddler pulled the child closer, eyes wide. An elderly man put down his magazine and stared. The air thickened with disbelief. Evelyn's cheeks burned crimson. She wanted to disappear into the floor, but she forced herself to keep moving, clutching her folder, whispering, "Please, not here, not like this." She reached for his arm, begging silently for him to lower his voice. That was when it happened. With a sharp crack that echoed against sterile walls, Alexander's hand connected with her cheek. The sound was louder than the beeping monitors, louder than the gasp of the nurse frozen in the doorway, louder than Evelyn's own heartbeat, shattering inside her chest. She stumbled back, one hand flying to her face, eyes filling with tears. Pain radiated through her skin, but it was nothing compared to the shame. Her knees threatened to buckle, her swollen belly trembling with the force of her sobs. Gasps erupted. "Oh my God!" a woman whispered. Someone pulled out a phone. Another shouted for security, but Alexander only straightened his cufflinks, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe now you'll learn to stop whining like a child. You're my wife. Act like it." The nurse's hands shook as she tried to help Evelyn stand. "Sir, this is a hospital. You can't." But her words were drowned by Evelyn's muffled sob. She couldn't even speak. All she could think of was the tiny heartbeat inside her, the child who deserved better than this violence, this cruelty. For a split second, Alexander looked around and realized everyone was watching. The eyes of strangers were no longer filled with admiration for his wealth, but with disgust. He sneered, grabbing Evelyn's wrist with unnecessary force. "Let's go. You're wasting enough of my time." His arrogance blinded him to the truth. His downfall had already begun. Because standing in the hallway, arriving late for the appointment he promised to attend, was Evelyn's father, Richard Cole, a name that could silence entire boardrooms. He was no ordinary man. He was a CEO whose empire stretched across industries, a titan whose handshake could raise or sink a company's value in seconds. He had been estranged from Evelyn for years after she chose love over legacy. But the moment his eyes locked onto the red mark blooming on his daughter's face, something inside him snapped. Richard's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Take your hands off her. Now." The crowd parted as if royalty had arrived. Alexander froze, his arrogance faltering for the first time. He stammered, "Richard, this is just a misunderstanding." But Richard's eyes, cold as steel, left no room for excuses. Every security guard in the building seemed to materialize at once, their radios crackling. Nurses whispered his name with reverence. Patients pulled out phones, capturing every second. The slap that Alexander thought would vanish into silence was now immortalized forever. Evelyn, trembling, turned her face toward her father, her lips quivering. For the first time in months, she felt safe. But she also felt terror. Terror that this moment of public shame was only the beginning of a war she hadn't been ready to fight. Richard reached for her gently, his hand protective on her shoulder, his voice softer now. "You're coming with me, sweetheart. You'll never spend another night with this man." The millionaire who thought he was untouchable had no idea what storm he had awakened. Because Richard Cole wasn't just a father. He was a man who built empires and crushed enemies in courtrooms without breaking a sweat. And now, every ounce of his power, every lawyer, every connection, every dollar would be used for one purpose: to destroy Alexander Grant. The hospital staff whispered. The security team escorted Alexander out, his protests drowned by the flashing phones of witnesses. Evelyn's tears slid down her bruised cheek as her father's arm guided her into the examination room. For the first time, she believed justice might finally find its way into her broken life. But what she didn't know was that this slap would spark a trial so explosive, so merciless, that Alexander would lose not just his fortune, but the very empire he believed made him a god. And the world? It would watch every second of his fall. Because the cameras were already rolling and Richard Cole was just getting started. Evelyn Cole Grant had not been born into weakness. Though she stood small and fragile in the hospital that night, her story was one of resilience, sacrifice, and misplaced faith in the wrong man. To understand her pain and the storm that was about to engulf Alexander Grant, you must first understand the quiet strength of the woman he thought he could break. Evelyn was 30 years old, the only daughter of Richard Cole, one of the most powerful CEOs in America. From the moment she entered the world, headlines predicted a dazzling future for her. The daughter of an empire, a princess of corporate royalty, she grew up surrounded by wealth that most people could only imagine. Mansions, private jets, yachts, those were simply the background noise of her childhood. But Evelyn's mother, Elizabeth, had insisted on raising her with humility. "Money can build walls," her mother used to say, "but kindness builds bridges." Elizabeth Cole passed away when Evelyn was just 16, leaving a hole in her heart that no amount of diamonds could fill. From that moment on, Evelyn clung to her mother's values, trying to live a life grounded in compassion rather than privilege. She studied literature at Columbia University, not finance or business as her father had hoped. She loved poetry, the way words could soothe pain and ignite hope. Richard, though proud in his own quiet way, often shook his head. "You could lead companies, Evelyn. You could lead nations. Why hide in books?" But Evelyn had no interest in boardrooms. She wanted love, a family, a life of meaning beyond stock prices and power plays. It was during her final year at Columbia that she met Alexander Grant. He was everything her father wasn't: charming, spontaneous, reckless with laughter and ambition. He wasn't born rich. He carried the swagger of a man who clawed his way up from nothing. A hustler in a sharp suit with a smile that promised the world. At first, Evelyn admired his drive. She saw him as proof that hard work could rival inheritance. Against her father's stern warnings, she fell in love. Their courtship was a whirlwind of late-night walks in Central Park, rooftop dinners beneath city lights, and whispered promises of forever. Alexander adored her beauty, flaunted her at parties, and told her she was the anchor to his storm. For a young woman yearning for warmth and belonging, his attention felt intoxicating. Richard Cole, however, was never convinced. "That boy looks at you like a trophy, not a partner," he warned one evening, his voice tight with concern. But Evelyn, stubborn in her belief in love, dismissed it as paternal protectiveness. She told herself Alexander's temper was just passion, his sharp words just stress. After all, wasn't every marriage about patience and compromise? So against her father's advice, she married him. She left behind the Cole empire, choosing instead to live in Alexander's world. She traded silk ballrooms for penthouse apartments, traded her father's empire for Alexander's startup dreams. For the first few years, it seemed worth it. She laughed as they ate Chinese takeout on the floor of their first apartment, celebrated when he closed his first $1 million deal, and believed every time he swore he was building a future for their family. But slowly, the cracks appeared. Alexander's ambition hardened into arrogance. He began treating her less like a partner and more like an accessory. Evelyn, pregnant with their first child, found herself alone at home while Alexander partied with investors and posed for magazines. Her once loving husband now criticized her weight, her clothes, her supposed laziness. She was carrying his child, yet he mocked her for being tired. She endured swollen ankles and sleepless nights, but instead of comfort, she received disdain. The man who had once brought her flowers now brought only sharp words. "Do you know how much money I could make if I didn't have to deal with your whining?" he once sneered during an argument. Still, Evelyn clung to hope. She told herself the baby would change things. She remembered her mother's words, "Kindness builds bridges," and hoped love could rebuild theirs. But the night he slapped her in that hospital, in front of strangers and staff, shattered the last illusion. That was the moment the world finally saw what she had been hiding. Her marriage was not love, it was prison. And yet Evelyn was not weak. Behind her trembling hands and tearful eyes, there was still the spirit of Elizabeth's daughter and Richard's bloodline. She was not a victim to be pitied, but a woman who had endured far too long. What Alexander had mistaken for fragility was in truth restraint. What he believed was silence was endurance. And what he thought was weakness would soon become the force that destroyed him. That night, after Richard led her away from the chaos, Evelyn sat in the quiet of her father's limousine, her cheeks still stinging. Her father watched her in silence, his jaw tight, his hand covering hers. Finally she whispered, "I thought I could change him." Richard's voice was low but steady. "Men like Alexander don't change, but they do fall, and Evelyn, I promise you, he will fall." The weight of those words settled over her like a vow. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost: safety. Her father had returned, not just as a powerful CEO, but as the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had promised to protect her from the monsters under the bed. This time, the monster wasn't hiding. It was sitting in a corner office, wearing a Rolex, and calling itself her husband. The Evelyn who walked into that hospital was broken, bruised, and afraid. But the Evelyn who left in her father's car that night was different. She was a woman standing on the edge of transformation, her pain crystallizing into resolve. She was no longer just a pregnant wife enduring cruelty. She was a daughter of Richard Cole, a woman of legacy, and soon, very soon, she would discover the power she had inherited all along. For Alexander, it was only the beginning of a nightmare he never saw coming. Because Evelyn's story was not about being slapped in silence. It was about rising in vengeance. The places where lives unravel often reveal more than words ever could. For Evelyn, the hospital, the penthouse, and the looming courtroom would each become symbols of pain, of betrayal, and finally, of reckoning. To truly grasp the scale of what was about to unfold, one must first walk through these spaces, breathe their air, and see how every wall carried echoes of choices and consequences. The hospital was supposed to be a sanctuary. Its maternity wing was lined with pastel walls, painted with cheerful murals of balloons and teddy bears, meant to soothe mothers waiting for their newborns. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. Nurses moved quickly, balancing efficiency with warmth, their smiles reassuring to anxious families. But for Evelyn, the hospital had become the stage of humiliation. The slap Alexander delivered in that waiting room lingered in the air long after security escorted him out. People still whispered days later. A nurse who had witnessed it retold the story in hushed tones in the cafeteria. "I've never seen a man hit a pregnant woman in public before. And the way her father looked at him. Oh, that man's life is finished." The hospital halls carried that memory like a scar. Evelyn, though grateful for her father's intervention, could not step into those sterile corridors without hearing the echo of that crack across her face. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield where her dignity had been torn down, but also where the first stone of Alexander's downfall had been laid. From the hospital, her life shifted back to the penthouse, a place that looked like heaven from the outside, but had long since felt like hell. The Grant penthouse towered over the city's skyline, a palace of glass and chrome perched 50 stories above Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed glittering lights at night, but inside, the air was cold, sterile, and silent. Every corner screamed wealth. Imported Italian marble, chandeliers dripping with crystals, designer furniture untouched except for staged photo shoots. It was a home built for appearances, not love. Evelyn often wandered through its cavernous rooms alone, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by endless space. The nursery that should have been filled with warmth was unfinished, the crib still in boxes. Alexander had promised to get around to it, but never cared enough to assemble the pieces. His office, by contrast, was immaculate, a shrine to his ambition. Mahogany shelves lined with awards, leather-bound books he never read. A massive desk where deals were struck, but where Evelyn's pleas for compassion were ignored. Here, Evelyn had cried quietly on nights when Alexander stumbled in, reeking of whiskey, his tie undone, his phone buzzing with messages from women whose names she would never know. Here she had clutched her stomach, whispering lullabies to a child she promised would never feel unloved, even if she herself was invisible. The penthouse was her cage, and though the locks were made of luxury, they still kept her trapped. But now, the penthouse was no longer her prison. With her father's return, it became evidence. Richard's legal team entered those rooms, photographing every untouched crib piece, documenting every receipt of Alexander's reckless spending, compiling proof of neglect, cruelty, and arrogance. What had once been Evelyn's silent suffering was transformed into testimony, a trail of documents and images that would soon be presented before the most powerful judges in New York. And then there was the courtroom. Unlike the hospital or the penthouse, Evelyn had not yet stepped into this setting, but it was coming. Richard Cole's empire included an army of attorneys who thrived in courtrooms, men and women who could dismantle billionaires with a single paragraph of cross-examination. The New York County Supreme Court, with its towering stone columns and echoing chambers, loomed on the horizon like a temple of justice. The benches, polished by decades of spectators, would soon bear witness to the clash between Alexander Grant, the millionaire who believed himself untouchable, and Richard Cole, the CEO father determined to crush him. Inside those walls, the air was heavy with tension. Lawyers whispered strategies, judges' gavels thundered to restore order, and the scent of paper and ink hung in the air. It was here that Alexander's carefully curated image of power and prestige would be stripped away. Every cruel word he had thrown at Evelyn, every dollar he had hidden, every mistress he had paraded, would come to light under oath. Evelyn feared the courtroom at first. The thought of sitting across from the man who had humiliated her, of reliving the pain in front of strangers, made her stomach churn. But her father's voice steadied her. "You don't walk into that courtroom alone," Richard told her, his hand firm on hers. "You walk in with me, with truth and with justice, and together we'll make sure he never hurts you or your child again." These three settings, the hospital, the penthouse, and the courtroom, were no longer just places. They were stages in a drama larger than Evelyn had ever imagined. The hospital represented her breaking point, the penthouse her captivity, and the courtroom her rebirth. Each space carried its own weight, its own scars, its own promise. And Alexander? He underestimated them all. He believed the hospital incident would fade into whispers. The penthouse secrets would stay hidden, and the courtroom would be yet another arena he could manipulate with money. But he had never faced a man like Richard Cole, nor realized that Evelyn herself was stronger than the silence she had endured. As the city buzzed with rumors, as tabloids speculated on the scandal of a millionaire striking his pregnant wife, and as lawyers prepared their strategies, one truth grew clearer by the day. These places would not protect Alexander. They would expose him. Because soon, under the blinding lights of the courtroom, Alexander Grant would learn the most brutal lesson of his life. Money could not shield him from the justice of a father's wrath and a daughter's rising voice. And when Evelyn finally stepped into that courtroom, the world would see not a broken wife, but the beginning of a reckoning. Every story of downfall begins with pride. For Alexander Grant, pride wasn't just a flaw, it was the very foundation of his existence. To the world, he was a millionaire visionary, a man who had climbed from middle-class obscurity into Manhattan's gilded elite. But behind the tailored suits, the champagne galas, and the sharp smile was a heart hardened by greed, vanity, and cruelty. If Evelyn was the soul of this story, Alexander was its darkness. Alexander grew up in Queens, the son of a struggling mechanic and a school teacher who stretched every dollar to feed their children. From an early age, he burned with resentment at poverty. He hated hand-me-downs, despised the shame of saying, "We can't afford it," and swore he would never live that way again. By the time he was in college, he had turned that resentment into hunger. Not hunger for knowledge, but hunger for power. At 21, he dropped out of business school, claiming professors were too small-minded to teach him. He sold cheap imported electronics out of a friend's basement, hustling customers with charisma and half-truths. By 25, he had leveraged credit cards and loans into a small startup, convincing investors with flashy pitches and inflated numbers. Some called it genius, others called it luck. Alexander called it destiny. As money began to pour in, so did arrogance. He learned to wear custom suits, to sip vintage wine, to sneer at waiters if they took too long. He practiced to smile in the mirror, a smile that could charm boardrooms while hiding contempt for everyone in them. His empire, though shaky in its foundation, grew on bravado. Investors believed him because he believed himself. And as his wealth swelled, so did his appetite for control. Evelyn entered his life at the height of his ascent. To outsiders, their union looked like a fairy tale, the self-made millionaire and the daughter of a CEO dynasty. For Alexander, however, Evelyn was not love, she was leverage. Having her on his arm added legitimacy, a bridge into circles he had always hungered for. The Coles were old money. Their name opened doors that his hustler background could not. Alexander played the role of doting husband well enough to fool Evelyn, but in his private thoughts, she was another acquisition, another asset in his empire. His cruelty started small, as it always does. He would criticize Evelyn's clothes, saying they weren't stylish enough for his image. He would remind her of his sacrifices, sneering, "I work 12 hours a day while you sit around with your books." At first she defended him to her friends, excusing his sharp words as stress. But his words grew sharper, his demands harsher. He expected her to entertain his colleagues, flatter his investors, and remain silent whenever he dismissed her opinions. When Evelyn became pregnant, Alexander saw the child not as a blessing, but as a burden. He complained about hospital bills even as he bought himself luxury watches. He scoffed at her cravings and mocked her exhaustion. "You're weak," he told her once as she lay on the couch with swollen feet. "My mother worked double shifts when she was pregnant, and you can't even cook dinner without whining." The slap in the hospital was not the first time he had raised his hand. Months earlier, in the privacy of their penthouse, he had shoved her during an argument over his late nights. She had stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a marble counter, and though the bruise faded, the fear did not. She kept the secret, too ashamed to tell her father, too hopeful that Alexander might change. But men like Alexander never change, they only escalate. Publicly, Alexander played the role of success flawlessly. Magazines called him a financial genius, and society pages photographed him with his trademark smirk, glass of champagne in hand. His social media feeds showed him donating oversized checks to charities, hosting glittering galas, shaking hands with senators. But those who worked closely with him knew the truth. Alexander Grant was a tyrant. Assistants cycled through his office every 3 months, broken by his rages. Business partners whispered of shady deals, of numbers that didn't quite add up. But his charisma, his sheer audacity kept the illusion alive. What made Alexander dangerous was not just his cruelty. It was his belief that he was untouchable. He thought money insulated him from consequence. He thought Evelyn's silence was eternal. He thought no one, not even Richard Cole, could touch him. That arrogance blinded him to the storm forming at his feet. When Richard confronted him at the hospital, Alexander's first instinct was not fear, but annoyance. He actually believed he could smooth it over with a handshake, a forced smile, perhaps even a check. He underestimated Richard, just as he had underestimated Evelyn. To him, people were pawns, women were trophies, fathers were obstacles to be brushed aside. His empire had taught him one lesson: that power bends to money. He was about to learn the opposite, that money crumbles before justice. But Alexander's true villainy wasn't only in what he did to Evelyn, it was in what he believed. Deep down, he believed love was weakness. He believed kindness was stupidity. He believed loyalty was a leash, and betrayal was power. He once bragged to a colleague over whiskey, "People forgive everything if you're rich enough. Affairs, lies, even cruelty, it all gets washed away by the next headline." That arrogance would prove fatal. For Evelyn, he had become a nightmare. For Richard, he had become a target. But for the world, he was about to become an example. Because the same cameras that once captured his gala smiles would soon capture his humiliation in court. The same investors who praised his genius would soon watch his empire collapse. And the same arrogance that made him slap a pregnant woman in public would be replayed as evidence of his unworthiness to hold fortune or respect. Alexander Grant believed he was invincible. But every empire falls, and his would not fall quietly. Because the higher a man climbs on lies and cruelty, the harder he crashes when truth finally strikes. Scandals rarely remain whispers in the shadows anymore. In an age where every hand holds a camera, every moment has the power to be broadcast, judged, and remembered forever. Alexander Grant believed he could control perception. For years, he curated his image with precision. Photo shoots, charity galas, magazine interviews. But on that fateful night in the hospital, when his hand struck Evelyn's cheek, the illusion shattered. The sound of that slap did not just echo in the waiting room, it ricocheted through the world. One teenager in the waiting room had captured the entire scene on her phone. The video, shaky but clear, showed Alexander towering over Evelyn, his voice dripping with contempt, followed by the sharp strike and Evelyn's stumble. The nurse's gasp, the patient's horrified whispers, and Richard Cole's thunderous voice demanding Alexander release his daughter, all of it was preserved in digital permanence. Within hours, the video was uploaded to social media. By morning, it had millions of views. "Millionaire slaps pregnant wife in hospital," screamed the headlines. News anchors replayed the footage with grave expressions, talk show hosts dissected the cruelty, and strangers around the world shook their heads in disbelief. Hashtags trended globally. "Justice for Evelyn," "No excuse for abuse," "Millionaire monster." For once, Alexander's name wasn't linked to triumph, but to shame. Evelyn, meanwhile, stayed silent. She remained in her father's estate, shielded from reporters by gates and guards. She held her belly, whispering to her unborn child, trying to make sense of the sudden whirlwind. All she wanted was peace, but the world demanded justice. And justice, her father promised, was coming. Alexander, on the other hand, fumed. He stormed through his penthouse, smashing glasses, shouting at his PR team, "It's fake! It's edited! They're out to ruin me!" But the video was undeniable. His own voice, his own hand, his own sneer, all broadcasted to millions. His attorneys advised him to apologize, to issue a tearful statement. But Alexander refused. "I don't apologize," he snapped. "I don't bow. People forget in a week. I'll ride it out." But this storm would not pass. Investors began pulling out. Stock in his company, Grant Dynamics, dropped 20% overnight. Partners canceled meetings. Charities returned his checks, saying they could not be associated with his values. For the first time, Alexander tasted something unfamiliar: consequence. The scandal grew. More women stepped forward, whispering stories of his temper, his arrogance, his unwanted advances at galas. Former assistants spoke anonymously to reporters, describing his verbal tirades and physical intimidation. Each new story fanned the flames. Alexander tried to sue one tabloid for defamation, but the lawsuit backfired, bringing even more attention to his cruelty. The hospital itself released a statement, condemning his actions and praising Richard Cole for intervening. That single line, "We stand with Evelyn," was shared across the nation. Alexander's empire was bleeding, and Richard was tightening the noose. Meanwhile, Evelyn's face, bruised, pale, but dignified, appeared on magazine covers. Some tried to paint her as a victim, but Richard refused to let that be her only story. He arranged a carefully controlled interview where Evelyn, her voice trembling but clear, spoke only a few words. "I stayed silent too long. Now I stand for myself and my child." The nation erupted in applause. In that moment, she became more than a wife. She became a symbol of every woman silenced by cruelty. And Alexander, he spiraled. Paparazzi caught him leaving nightclubs with different women, his eyes bloodshot, his smirk gone. He tried to stage a comeback speech at a private investor dinner, but someone leaked a recording of him ranting, "She'll come crawling back. Women like her always do." The recording only fueled the fire. Richard Cole saw opportunity. He summoned his legal team. "We'll take him to court. Every dollar, every asset, every lie, exposed." For Richard, this wasn't only about vengeance. It was about protecting his daughter, about sending a message that no man, no matter how rich, could harm her without consequence. The courtroom date was set. The city buzzed with anticipation. It was no longer just Evelyn versus Alexander. It was justice versus corruption, and the world would be watching. Evelyn, though nervous, found strength in the storm. She no longer wept in silence. She prepared her testimony with quiet resolve, knowing the courtroom would demand her to relive her worst moments. Her father assured her, "You won't stand there alone. The truth will stand with you." The public incident had started as humiliation, but it transformed into a rallying cry. The hospital waiting room became more than a scene of cruelty. It became the spark of revolution in Evelyn's life. And for Alexander, the man who thought he could bury the truth, it became the grave of his empire. Because some slaps don't fade, they echo until the whole world demands justice. Strength is not born in silence, it is forged in the fire of breaking. After the hospital incident and the viral storm that followed, Evelyn Cole Grant found herself caught between two worlds. The woman who had once believed in fairy tales, and the woman the world suddenly wanted her to become. Everyone saw her as a symbol of resistance, a face on magazine covers, a trending hashtag. But behind the closed doors of her father's estate, she was simply a daughter trembling in the aftermath of humiliation. The days immediately after the scandal were a blur. Evelyn stayed in the guest wing of Richard's mansion, the same house she had grown up in before leaving to marry Alexander. The grand halls, lined with oil paintings of ancestors, felt both familiar and suffocating. She wandered them like a ghost, her hand always resting on her swollen belly, whispering lullabies through tears. Her father's staff treated her with the reverence of someone sacred, but it only deepened her sense of fragility. She didn't want reverence, she wanted her life back. Everywhere she turned, the world reminded her of the slap. The television blared with commentators dissecting her expression, her silence, her tears. Tabloids speculated about her future. Was she filing for divorce? Would she reconcile? Would she inherit Alexander's fortune? Reporters camped outside the estate, their cameras flashing whenever she dared step onto the balcony. "Evelyn, Evelyn, do you forgive him?" they shouted, voices clawing at her peace. At night, she lay awake haunted by the sound of Alexander's voice. The contempt in his words replayed in her mind. "You're just fat with that baby. Hurry up." She would bolt upright, her cheek tingling with phantom pain, her chest tight with panic. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let it get this far." Guilt consumed her. She blamed herself for ignoring the red flags, for silencing her instincts, for marrying a man her father had warned her about. She felt ashamed that she had endured months of belittlement and still stayed. "I was weak," she sobbed to her reflection one morning. "I was so weak." Her reflection stared back, tired eyes, pale skin, swollen body. She didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Her father tried to console her, but Richard's presence was both a comfort and a reminder of failure. "You are not weak," he said, his voice steady. "You are my daughter. You're stronger than you think." But Evelyn shook her head, tears spilling. "If I was strong, I would have left him long ago. I should have never." She couldn't finish. For days she refused to eat. Meals brought by the estate's chef remained untouched. She lost weight, though she could hardly afford to. Doctors scolded her gently, reminding her that stress could harm the baby. Evelyn nodded, promised to take care, but inside she was unraveling. She avoided mirrors. She avoided sunlight. She hid from the world, and even from herself. The once gentle sound of her baby's kicks now filled her with dread. How could she raise a child alone? How could she protect someone when she couldn't even protect herself? Her collapse reached its peak one stormy night. Rain pounded against the mansion's windows as Evelyn sat curled on the floor of her childhood bedroom. Boxes of old memories surrounded her. Her mother's letters, her childhood journals, photographs of birthdays and vacations long before Alexander. She clutched a letter from her mother, written years before her death. Evelyn, remember this. Life will test you, but you are never powerless. Even when you feel broken, you carry the strength of every woman who came before you. The words blurred through her tears. For hours, she wept, her sobs echoing against the walls. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the chaos inside her. She whispered to her unborn child, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be enough." But then, in the darkest hour, something shifted. She felt a strong, unmistakable kick inside her. It startled her, forced her to catch her breath. The child was alive, vibrant, demanding to be acknowledged. Evelyn pressed both hands against her belly, her tears slowing. For the first time in days, she felt not guilt, not despair, but a flicker of connection. "You're fighting, aren't you?" she whispered. "You're still fighting, even when I'm not." It was a small moment, but it planted a seed. Her father noticed the change the next morning. She appeared at breakfast, pale but determined, eating for the first time in days. "I have to," she told him softly. "For the baby." Richard nodded, pride hidden behind his stern expression. He knew the road would still be long, but he saw the first spark of resilience returning. Still, the collapse had left scars. Evelyn remained fragile, her hands trembling during interviews, her eyes haunted when lawyers asked her to recount Alexander's cruelty. But beneath the fragility was something beginning to harden. She was tired of being pitied, tired of being whispered about, tired of being the symbol of shame in a story she hadn't written. Her collapse had broken her, but it had also cleansed her. The Evelyn who lay on the floor sobbing was gone. In her place was a woman who had nothing left to lose. And when a woman has nothing left to lose, she becomes unstoppable. Because out of the ashes of collapse rises the flame of transformation. And Evelyn was about to burn brighter than she'd ever had. The world believed Evelyn's story had ended with humiliation. They saw a pregnant wife struck in public, retreating into her father's mansion like a fragile bird hiding from the storm. What they didn't know was that Evelyn's father, Richard Cole, was no ordinary man. Behind his calm exterior and silvered temples was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Alexander Grant thought he had won by silencing Evelyn with fear. He was about to learn the truth. Richard had been sharpening his claws for decades, and now he had a reason to unleash them. Richard Cole wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a titan. His company, Cole International, wasn't confined to one industry. It sprawled across finance, real estate, energy, and technology. Politicians answered his calls within minutes. Judges owed him favors. Journalists sought his approval before printing their stories. He had cultivated a network of power so vast it was invisible to ordinary eyes. To him, Alexander was nothing more than a cockroach in a skyscraper. Loud, flashy, but ultimately crushable. Yet Richard had stayed quiet for years, respecting Evelyn's choice to marry Alexander, despite his doubts. He had promised himself he wouldn't interfere, that his daughter had the right to live her life, even if it meant stumbling. But when he saw Alexander's hand strike her in that hospital, something inside him broke. Not just as a father, but as a man. He realized he had given Evelyn space when what she needed was protection. And so, he vowed that the man who hurt his daughter would not only lose his fortune, he would lose everything. The twist began with silence. While Alexander raged on television, insisting the video was fake, Richard made no public statements. While investors panicked, Richard quietly bought stock in Alexander's company through shell corporations, destabilizing the board. While reporters swarmed outside the Cole estate, Richard's legal team worked day and night, gathering evidence of Alexander's fraud, affairs, and abuse. The world thought Richard was waiting, but in truth, he was already pulling strings. Evelyn didn't understand the scale of her father's reach until one evening when he invited her into his study. The room smelled of leather and cedar, lined with books and old photographs. On the massive oak desk lay a stack of documents. Richard gestured for her to sit. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, sliding a folder toward her. Evelyn opened it with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, shell company records, evidence of Alexander siphoning funds, hiding assets, manipulating investors. Her breath caught. How do you have this?" Richard's eyes hardened. "I've had men watching him since the day you married him. I hoped I would never need it. But now it's time. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, a mix of shock and relief. All those years, while she had felt alone, her father had quietly prepared. "You knew," she whispered. "I suspected," Richard corrected. "And I was ready. That's what power is, Evelyn. Not money, not fame, preparation, patience, and now it's his turn to bleed." The strategy was brutal. Richard's attorneys filed for emergency court hearings demanding financial audits of Alexander's company. His PR team leaked carefully chosen documents to the press, tax irregularities, shady overseas deals, unpaid employees. Each leak was timed like a dagger, striking just as Alexander tried to rebuild his image. Within weeks, Grant Dynamics was no longer a rising star but a sinking ship. Stock plummeted. Investors fled. Former allies turned on him, desperate to protect their own reputations. And still, Richard wasn't finished. He reached into his political network, whispering in ears that Alexander's businesses should be investigated for fraud. Regulators descended. The man who had once bragged that rules didn't apply to him suddenly found himself buried under subpoenas. Through it all, Evelyn watched in awe. She had known her father was powerful, but she had never understood the depth of his influence. For the first time since the slap, she felt something stronger than despair. Hope. She wasn't alone. She had an army, led by a man who had spent his life mastering the art of war in boardrooms and courtrooms. Alexander, however, was unraveling. The more Richard struck, the more desperate he became. He called Evelyn late one night, his voice hoarse, trembling with rage. "You think hiding behind your daddy makes you strong? You'll regret this, Evelyn. You'll regret crossing me." Evelyn, holding the phone with steady hands, finally spoke words she never thought she'd find the courage to say. "I don't regret anything. Not anymore." And she hung up. That single moment marked her rebirth. The woman who once wept alone in penthouse rooms was gone. In her place was someone who had learned the truth. Her silence had never protected her, but her voice could destroy him. The twist wasn't just Richard's power, it was Evelyn's awakening. For the first time, father and daughter stood united, not as a frightened victim and her protector, but as allies. Together, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were preparing for victory. And Alexander? He still clung to the illusion that money could save him. But he didn't realize that the very empire he built was already slipping from his grasp. Richard had positioned every piece on the chessboard, and the checkmate was inevitable. Because when a father fights for his daughter, there is no empire strong enough to survive his wrath. Evelyn Cole Grant had always been gentle, soft-spoken, and understated. For years, Alexander had mistaken that gentleness for weakness, convincing himself she would never rise against him. But the storm that followed the hospital incident changed everything. She had collapsed, yes, cried, doubted, broken, but collapse was not the end. It was the beginning of transformation. And when Evelyn rose, she rose with a fire no one could have predicted. The shift began quietly. No makeover starts with clothes or makeup, it starts with the soul. Evelyn, who once whispered apologies to her unborn child in the dark, began whispering promises instead. "I will protect you. I will fight for you. I will never let anyone hurt us again." Each night, she repeated those vows until her voice grew stronger, steadier. Her child became her anchor, and with each kick in her belly, she felt courage replacing fear. Her father noticed the change first. One morning, when Evelyn entered the breakfast room at the estate, Richard set down his newspaper and studied her. She was still pale, still tired, but her eyes had sharpened. They no longer drifted downward in shame. They met his directly, burning with something new. "I'm ready," she told him simply. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Richard nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "Then let's begin." The transformation moved outward. Evelyn's old wardrobe, modest dresses chosen to appease Alexander's criticism, was replaced with clothes that reflected strength. Her father's staff arranged fittings with designers who understood her journey. Out went the muted tones of submission. In came tailored suits in bold colors, flowing dresses that accentuated her pregnancy while radiating dignity. When she first stood before the mirror in a sleek navy gown, her belly cradled proudly, she whispered, "This is me." Her hair, once left in simple styles, was cut and shaped to frame her face with confidence. Makeup artists taught her how to highlight the sharpness in her eyes, the determination in her jawline. But the greatest change wasn't physical. It was the way she carried herself. Her shoulders squared. Her steps grew deliberate. Her voice, once trembling, now carried weight. The media noticed immediately. When Evelyn appeared in public for the first time since the scandal, cameras clicked furiously. Gone was the timid, tearful woman hiding behind sunglasses. In her place was a radiant, composed figure, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her father by her side. Headlines blazed, Evelyn Cole returns, stronger than ever, from victim to victor, the rise of a CEO's daughter. But transformation was not only about image, it was about action. Richard encouraged Evelyn to sit in on strategy meetings with his lawyers. At first, she listened quietly, intimidated by legal jargon. But soon, she began asking questions, pointing out details others missed. "He kept all our accounts separate," she said once, her voice calm. "He didn't let me touch anything. If you look at the transfers around our wedding, you'll see where he started hiding assets." The lawyers exchanged impressed glances. She wasn't just a client, she was becoming a strategist. Day by day, Evelyn learned. She studied documents, memorized timelines, rehearsed testimony. Her father's advisors, once skeptical, came to respect her insight. "She has her mother's sharpness," one whispered to Richard. "And your fire." But Evelyn's transformation wasn't fueled only by her father's resources. It was fueled by her own decision to reclaim her life. She reconnected with old friends she had abandoned during her marriage, reaching out with apologies and honesty. "I lost myself," she admitted, "but I'm finding my way back." Some embraced her immediately, others cautiously, but each reunion strengthened her sense of identity beyond Alexander's shadow. She also found solace in helping others. When the Chash to Justice for Evelyn movement exploded online, women across the country shared their own stories of abuse. Evelyn, once silent, began replying. "You are not alone," she wrote. "You are stronger than you think." Those words, simple but sincere, inspired thousands. For the first time, Evelyn realized her pain had purpose. It could give others hope. Her transformation reached its peak the night she attended a charity gala hosted by her father's foundation. It was her first major public appearance since the scandal, and the world was watching. Cameras flashed as she arrived, radiant in a crimson gown that shimmered under chandeliers. She walked arm in arm with Richard, her belly displayed proudly, her chin lifted high. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "She looks incredible. She's not hiding anymore." Alexander, watching from afar through news coverage, seethed. He had expected Evelyn to cower, to remain a broken shadow. Instead, she was commanding the spotlight he once hoarded for himself. For the first time, fear crept into his arrogance. He realized she was no longer the woman he could control. At the gala, Evelyn took the stage briefly, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "A few months ago, I thought my story was over. I thought my voice didn't matter. But I was wrong. Every woman has a voice. Every woman has the right to be heard, to be safe, to be respected. And I promise you, my story is not ending. It's only beginning." The audience erupted in applause, some with tears in their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just witnessed a defining moment. Evelyn wasn't just Richard Cole's daughter anymore. She was becoming a force in her own right. Her transformation was complete, not because she changed into someone new, but because she returned to the woman she had always been, buried beneath Alexander's cruelty. The gentle girl who once loved poetry had grown into a woman of resilience, a mother ready to fight for her child, and a survivor prepared to face her abuser, not with fear, but with power. And as she stepped off the stage, Richard whispered in her ear, "Now he should be afraid." Because when a woman rises from ashes, she doesn't just stand, she soars. And Evelyn was soaring straight toward justice. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the marble steps, their microphones clutched tight, their cameras flashing like lightning against the gray morning sky. Inside, spectators filled the benches, whispering in excitement. This was not just a legal battle, it was a public reckoning. Everyone wanted to see the millionaire who once seemed untouchable face the father and daughter who had vowed to end him. Evelyn stepped out of the black limousine first, radiant and composed in a tailored ivory suit that framed her growing belly. Her father followed, his presence commanding respect in a charcoal suit. They walked side by side through the flashing cameras, unflinching, while chants erupted from the crowd. "Justice for Evelyn! Justice for Evelyn!" Alexander arrived minutes later, his swagger noticeably dimmed. Gone was the smirk that once charmed investors. He wore a forced smile, clutching his lawyer's arm as though that could shield him. But the crowd's boos drowned out his attempts at confidence. Signs waved in the air, "No excuse for abuse. Power won't protect you." For the first time in his career, Alexander faced a world that despised him. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to choke. The judge presided from a high bench, her gavel ready to command silence. Richard's legal team sat with mountains of documents neatly stacked, while Alexander's lawyers whispered frantically, flipping through their notes. Evelyn sat between her father and a seasoned attorney, her hands resting calmly on her belly. Though her heart pounded, her eyes were steady. She was not here to hide. She was here to fight. The opening statement set the tone. Richard's lead attorney rose first, his voice deep and steady. "This case is not only about money," he declared. "It is about cruelty, deception, and justice for a woman silenced for far too long. We will show you the truth about Alexander Grant, a man who built his empire on lies and treated his wife as nothing more than property. But today, the truth will prevail." The room stirred with murmurs. Alexander's lawyer tried to counter, painting Evelyn as an emotional woman, exaggerating private disputes. "Marriage is complicated," he insisted. "Arguments happen. My client is guilty of nothing more than a lapse of temper." But the jury's eyes narrowed. The video of the hospital slap had already spoken louder than any excuse. Then the evidence began. Richard's team unveiled documents proving Alexander's financial fraud. Bank records showed millions funneled into offshore accounts. Emails revealed secret deals with corrupt partners. Witnesses testified. Former assistants, former girlfriends, even business associates, each telling stories of his temper, his arrogance, his abuse. Piece by piece, Alexander's empire crumbled under the weight of truth. But the most powerful moment came when Evelyn herself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the witness chair, her steps deliberate, her head high. She swore an oath, then faced the jury. For a moment she hesitated, her throat tight. Then she began. She spoke of the early days of their marriage, the charm that had blinded her, the gradual descent into control and cruelty. She described the nights she cried alone, the words that cut deeper than knives, the fear that grew with each act of violence. Her voice trembled at times, but she never stopped. When she recounted the slap in the hospital, her hand unconsciously brushed her cheek, and the jury leaned forward, captivated. "I stayed silent," she said, her voice breaking but clear, "because I thought silence would keep me safe, but silence only gave him power. I will not be silent anymore. Not for me, not for my child, not for anyone who has ever been hurt and told to endure it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some spectators wiping tears. Even the judge's expression softened before she rapped the gavel for order. Alexander, red-faced, clenched his fists, whispering angrily to his lawyer. When his turn came to testify, he smirked, trying to regain control. He denied everything, insisting Evelyn was exaggerating, that she was too sensitive. But under cross-examination, Richard's attorneys cornered him. They showed the hospital video, replaying the slap in slow motion. They read his cruel texts aloud to the jury. "You're nothing without me. Stop whining and do your job." Each word dug deeper into the coffin of his defense. Finally, Richard himself took the stand. Not as a CEO, but as a father. His testimony was brief but devastating. "I watched that man strike my daughter while she carried his child," he said, his voice low but thunderous in its weight. "I swore then that he would never harm her again, and I will keep that promise." The courtroom fell into a hush so profound it felt sacred. The trial stretched for weeks, but the outcome was clear from the start. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreman stood tall. "We, the jury, find in favor of Evelyn Cole Grant. We order Alexander Grant to relinquish 50% of his assets, face federal investigation for fraud, and grant sole custody to Evelyn." Gasps filled the room. Cameras outside exploded with flashes as the verdict spread like wildfire. Evelyn exhaled, tears spilling down her cheeks, not of despair, but of triumph. Richard squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening with pride. Alexander, meanwhile, collapsed into his chair, pale and trembling. His fortune, his reputation, his freedom, all slipping away. The man who once believed himself untouchable now sat shackled by the very system he had mocked. Evelyn stood, her belly leading her forward, and walked past him without a glance. She didn't need to gloat. Her silence, once a prison, had become the sharpest weapon. The world saw her not as a victim, but as a victor. Outside the courthouse, the chants rose again. Justice for Evelyn! Justice for Evelyn! She stepped before the microphones, her voice steady. Today isn't just about me. It's about every woman who has been silenced. Every woman who has been told she was too weak, too small, too powerless. Let this be proof you are stronger than they will ever admit, and when you stand, the world will stand with you. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the city streets. Because revenge is sweetest not in private whispers, but in public victories, and Evelyn's triumph was now etched into history. The courthouse battle had ended, but for Evelyn, the story was only beginning. The day the verdict was read, she returned to her father's estate, not as the broken woman who had entered it months earlier, but as someone reborn. The cameras captured her smiling through tears, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her father beside her like a pillar of strength. Across the world, women cheered her courage, fathers admired Richard's resolve, and Alexander Grant's name became synonymous with disgrace. But Evelyn's true victory wasn't in the millions stripped from Alexander's fortune or the headlines celebrating her triumph. Her victory was quieter, deeper. It was in the steady beat of her heart, no longer racing with fear. It was in the freedom to wake up each morning without dread. It was in the certainty that her child would be born into a world where love, not cruelty, reigned. The weeks after the trial were filled with change. Alexander's empire collapsed under investigation, his assets frozen, his name dragged through courts and headlines. He was no longer a millionaire tycoon, but a disgraced fraudster awaiting sentencing. His penthouse, once a fortress of arrogance, was stripped bare by creditors. He had fallen, and there was no rising again. Evelyn, meanwhile, embraced her new role, not as Alexander's former wife, not even just as Richard's daughter, but as her own woman. She launched a foundation for women and children escaping abusive homes, naming it the Phoenix Fund. Reporters asked why she chose that name. She smiled softly and said, "Because even from ashes, we rise." Donations poured in from around the globe. Survivors wrote her letters, thanking her for giving them hope. She read each one with tears in her eyes, determined to honor their voices. Her transformation rippled outward. No longer hiding, she attended public events with grace and confidence, her presence commanding respect. When she walked into a room, people no longer whispered about pity. They spoke of admiration. She wasn't a scandal anymore, she was a symbol. Her father, though proud, often reminded her to rest. "You're carrying the next generation," Richard said one evening as they sat in the garden, the summer breeze rustling the trees. Evelyn smiled, resting her hands on her belly. "Yes," she whispered, "but I'm also carrying myself now, and I won't ever put myself down again." The day her child was born was the true climax of her journey. In a private hospital suite, surrounded by trusted doctors and her father at her side, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held her daughter for the first time. "Welcome home, my love," she whispered. "You'll never know fear. You'll only know love." Richard, holding the tiny bundle later, whispered to his granddaughter, "You're the reason we fought, and you'll always be safe." The world celebrated the birth, with headlines calling the baby a new symbol of hope. But for Evelyn, it was personal. It was healing. Holding her daughter, she finally released the last fragments of guilt and pain. She realized she had been strong all along. Her silence had never been weakness. It had only been waiting for the right moment to roar. Months passed, and Evelyn flourished. Her foundation expanded. Her voice became sought after at conferences and interviews. She didn't glamorize her suffering, but she spoke of it with honesty, reminding others that dignity could be reclaimed. Each speech ended with the same words, "Your voice is your power. Never give it away." As for Alexander, his name became a cautionary tale. He was sentenced to prison for fraud, his wealth dismantled, his reputation beyond repair. The man who once believed the world revolved around him was forgotten, a footnote in Evelyn's story of triumph. 1 year after the trial, Evelyn returned to the same hospital where the slap had shattered her world. This time, she walked in with her daughter in her arms, her father beside her. Nurses and patients recognized her immediately, their eyes wide. But instead of whispers of pity, they greeted her with smiles, applause, even tears. Evelyn stopped in the very waiting room where it had all begun. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "We turned pain into power." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and proud. "You didn't just survive, Evelyn, you conquered." Evelyn looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had been broken, humiliated, silenced. But now she stood tall, her child in her arms, her father by her side, her own strength radiating for the world to see. Her journey had taught her the deepest truth. Pain could break you, but it could also build you. Silence could chain you, but it could also prepare you to shout louder than ever before. And love for a child, for family, for oneself, was the greatest weapon of all. As she left the hospital that day, cameras waiting outside captured her radiant smile. Headlines blared once more, but this time they weren't about scandal. They were about triumph. From slap to strength, Evelyn Cole's unstoppable rise. And as the world celebrated her, Evelyn whispered one final vow to her daughter. "No one will ever silence us again. We are free, we are strong, and we will always rise." So, my dear friends, that's how the story ends. And yet I know, if you're still here with me until this very moment, something in this journey has touched your heart in a way you maybe didn't expect. Maybe it reminded you of your own battles, maybe it stirred up old wounds, or maybe it simply reminded you how precious dignity and love really are. Here's what I believe. Life will always test us. We may not control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." Isn't that true? Evelyn couldn't change Alexander's cruelty, but she chose to rise. She chose to stand, to fight, and to protect not only herself, but the life growing inside her. And in doing so, she found freedom. Friends, healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means deciding the pain will no longer control you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." What broke Evelyn became the very thing that gave her strength. And maybe that's true for you too. So if you've been hurt, if you've been silenced, if you've carried wounds that no one else can see, remember this. Your story is not over. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. And sometimes the darkest nights create the brightest mornings. Now, if this story touched you, if it made you feel something real, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that remind us what really matters.